everyone, good evening. Thank you so much for joining the Maryland Center for History and Culture for our virtual program this evening. My name is Sophie Garcia, and I am the Public Programs and Outreach Manager here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. I will be hosting the program tonight, our Lord Baltimore Fellow Virtual Lecture, tonight focused on disability in education at the Maryland School for the Blind from 1853 to 1910. This program is being recorded and will be made available for public viewing on our virtual program archive in the following weeks. Please use our Q&A feature, and for now, I'll pass it along to Martina Cotto. She'll be our moderator for tonight, and she is the Vice President of Research at the Franz Marek and the Franz Marek Director of the H. Furlong Baldwin Library. So take it from here, Martina.
Thank you, Sophie. And thank you everybody else for joining us tonight. It's a special treat as our public programming season is in full swing. And tonight we are opening with our first research fellowship lecture. So as you know, we have research fellows at the H. Furlong Baldwin Library every year. And this is our first lecture of the season. I am excited to welcome Dr. Amanda Stuckey tonight. And I will tell you a little bit about her work so far and why she's here. So Dr. Amanda Stuckey is an associate professor of English at Central Penn College, where she teaches writing and humanities courses. Her research focuses on intersecting histories of disability and education during the long 19th century. And her work has appeared in a number of publications, including Studies in American Fiction, Disability Studies Quarterly, and American periodicals, among others. Her co-edited collection, titled Students in the Archives, Pedagogy and Practice, is forthcoming from the University of Illinois Press. And in her library for the past almost year, she has been working on a new book project, which will begin to recover the history of reading in U.S. schools for visually impaired students. I'm also very excited to add that Dr. Stuckey has been working with us in another capacity in addition to being our Lord Baltimore Fellow this year. Namely, she has been the managing editor of our special issue of the Maryland Historical Magazine, which will be dedicated to this commemorative America 250 year and is slated to publish later this summer. So with that, I think it's time to start our lecture. Let me invite on screen Dr. Amanda Stuckey. Please join us and take it away.
Thank you so much. I'll begin sharing my screen and start. I want to begin by thanking everyone who is facilitating the Zoom tonight. Sophie, Tyler, and Martina, thank you so much for putting this together. And thank you so much to everyone I've encountered at the MCHC in various capacities who've made my time there so fruitful. So thank you so much for this amazing opportunity. Thank you all also for taking a Tuesday night, where I am at least, a beautiful Tuesday night or evening to be joining us virtually on this program. This talk originates with my book project, which is entitled Recovering Touch: Embossed Books and Their Readers in the 19th Century United States. In this project, I examine the history of blind education through exploring what students, visually impaired students, read. This reading, of course, happened by touch, not by sight. And touch-based reading gave rise to what scholars have called raised print culture. And so it's a term I'll be using tonight, which comprises embossed reading materials such as the Braille, with which we're probably familiar today. But as I show in my book, and in a slightly different way in this talk, Braille was actually not the predominant raised print system used during the 19th century. I'll tell that story through a closer look at the Maryland School for the Blind, which is still in operation today on Taylor Avenue in Baltimore. Narrating the history of the Maryland School for the Blind through the different raised print forms that the school used from its founding in 1853, and actually I'll even start a little bit before that, to the standardization of Braille in 1927, demonstrates the ways in which raised print sought to advance the school's mission of intertwined academic and industrial training that would earn students a place in the reading and laboring world, or the sighted world. So this was true of a lot of the education and programming at the Maryland School for the Blind in the 19th century. What is now the Maryland School for the Blind was chartered as the Maryland Institution for the Instruction of the Blind in 1853 on West Saratoga Street in Baltimore. Throughout this talk, for consistency and clarity, I'll refer to the Maryland School for the Blind as the MSB, even though it went through several name changes throughout its history. At the time it was established, it was the 15th school for the blind in the United States, but it was and always has been a private school. But it has received a lot of state aid over the years, and certainly it received a lot of state funding in its start. And from this notice that you can see on the screen, this was published with the school's charter. You can read about dominant attitudes towards blindness at this time. These were not unique to the MSB. These characterized attitudes toward blindness, even by educators at this time in the 19th century. The pamphlet refers to blind Marylanders as, quote, a most unfortunate and helpless class of beings who were, quote, hopelessly enveloped in total darkness. With attitudes toward blindness that viewed it as a calamity, schooling was almost revolutionary, almost unheard of. It purported that with schooling, this group of students could learn literature, science, music, math, just like common or public school students could, and that they could also learn an industrial trade or handicraft that could lead to independence and self-support, preventing them from becoming what this pamphlet quotes as a burden on society. So we can see some attitudes that we might read as ableist today, but that were very much ingrained in perceptions of blindness by school educators, by the general public during this time. One of the most significant innovations of blind schooling also bore these attitudes in the form of what we could call ocular centrism, or belief in the primacy of the visual. Like that was sort of the best and most important way of understanding the world. These attitudes were applied even to visually impaired education. And they showed up in materials that visually impaired students were meant to read in school settings. So on the screen, you can see an example. This calls a specimen of print that was published with the MSB's charter on a page of embossed text that demonstrates how students in schools like the MSB attained their education through what we can call raised print. When we think about blind reading or reading by touch, we often think of Braille, but the 19th century, early 20th century history of the MSB and other schools shows the experiments with different raised print systems besides Braille. In particular, during the 19th century, school administrators, educators, and even students experimented with raised Roman letters, like what we see on this slide, for students to read by touch. Educators justified raised Roman letters with the belief that using these letters would align blind readers with sighted ones because they would all be reading the same letters, one in ink, one embossed in paper. These justifications, which characterized many schools for the blind at the time, sought to assimilate blind readers into an ocular-centric world, one centered on sight. And it is through experiments with raised print, like we see here in this specimen, which is not really meant for a blind reader to read. It is meant for a sighted audience to kind of witness as a testament to the school's instructional methods, that we can trace the MSB's students' experiences. I'm suggesting that tracing the MSB's use of various raised print forms reveals a range of attitudes towards students, but also allows us to consider how students themselves experienced their education, in particular, the MSB's mission of preparing them for self-support and independence in a sighted world. To tell this story, I have expanded the chronology a little bit from what I originally provided, thanks to some research I was able to do at the MCHC last week, actually. And I've sort of laid out my approach here in these bullet points. And while the chronology overlaps at times and is kind of chunky, I guess you could say, I approach the intertwined history of student experiences and raised print in 3 phases, looking first at the earliest generations of MSB students, roughly 1837 to 1878, the establishment of a segregated department at the MSB in 1872, and the extension of reading and industrial instruction beyond MSB school walls, starting in 1908. Again, this is a loose chronology and I don't want it to be misleading. For example, the asterisk is there because segregation didn't end in 1916. That's just sort of when I capped my research for this talk. The schools are actually integrated in 1955. But that's just where I put an endpoint for this phase in my research. So recognizing that the chronology is not perfect, but can be a helpful way of understanding students' experiences with raised print in these different phases. You'll probably notice that the starting point for this chronology predates the MSB charter, which was again 1853. That's because the state of Maryland actually funded blind education several years before the MSB was established. In 1837, the Maryland General Assembly approved an act to provide for the instruction of indigent blind persons, inhabitants of this state, which allocated state funds to provide education for, quote, indigent blind, or those who could not provide an education for themselves or whose families couldn't. And they would go to other state institutions. Most often, they went to the Pennsylvania Institution for the Instruction of the Blind, which is now Overbrook, a still functioning school in Philadelphia. So even before the MSB was established, the state of Maryland was considering and providing support for education of certain blind Marylanders. One of the first recipients of this appropriation of funds was a girl named Rebecca E. LaFleur from Baltimore. And so she would have been in the category of the indigent blind. According to school records, LaFleur entered the Pennsylvania institution around 1839, probably around the age of 9. This was a residential school, so she would have lived at the school in Philadelphia. One of the first things LaFleur would have encountered would have been raised print textbooks, which the Pennsylvania institution proudly embossed and experimented with on their sort of homegrown in-house press. So in this slide, you can see the title page of one of the textbooks LaFleur may have encountered, called A Guide to Spelling for the Blind. It was embossed in 1839 in a raised print system known as Philadelphia line type. You can see it's maybe hard to see, but it's embossed in a landscape format with all sort of uppercase Roman letters. This is an example of what was still experimental raised printing during the 1830s. It was really expensive to produce books like this. They were huge. I have a picture later in the presentation that shows how big they are. And they were really kind of inefficient, especially it's hard to get a sense of scale, but if you're a child reader with small hands, small body to kind of crowd around this giant book. But, this was in schools for the blind that had presses, this was a major sort of focus of their energy, was to produce these raised print books, all of which were in raised Roman letters. Philadelphia line type is also used on this specimen of print that we looked at earlier. While at the Pennsylvania institution, Lafleur may have crossed paths with a fellow student named David Laurie. Laurie graduated from the Pennsylvania Institution and then actually from the University of Pennsylvania, and was the founding director and principal of the Maryland School for the Blind. So it's an early example of a student who had gone through the course of blind education as a visually impaired student, and who's, kind of dedicated his life's work to blind schooling in the form of his role as principal of the MSB. So he very likely brought knowledge, if not materials, from the Pennsylvania institution to the MSB that were embossed in Philadelphia line type. So even though the MSB never had a press operation to the extent of the Philadelphia institution, he probably brought these materials with him, and the MSB throughout the 19th century purchased materials from schools that did have presses. It seems that when Laurie helped open the MSB in the 1850s, Rebecca Lafleur re-enrolled in school, this time at the MSB. You can see this list of students from the MSB's 1858 annual report shows her name as one of the students. She would have been in her mid-20s at this time, so an older student, and she likely enrolled not so much for the academic training, but to learn a trade, particularly in music. There's some newspaper accounts of a Miss Lafleur, blind woman of Baltimore, who put on performances in Baltimore. I haven't been able to confirm for sure that it's the same, but there's certainly some threads to follow there. And so getting training in music or handicrafts was viewed as more appropriate for older students, so that they could learn a skill that would allow them, hopefully, to be self-supporting. And it is a desire for self-support and independence that Lafleur describes in an artifact at the MCHC that is sort of, for me, the touchstone of this research, and that was used, I believe, with the promotional materials for this talk. This is the full view of one page of a letter that Lafleur composed in 1859 at the MSB, using a style of writing called, at different times, pinpoint writing, pinprick writing, or simply referred to as stamping, which kind of gives you a sense of the process. With this method, students compose text using little wooden blocks with individual characters formed out of pinpoints on the ends, stamping out their words one letter at a time. As you can imagine, this was a tedious and time-consuming process, but it did provide a unique form of access at this time. Students learned to write with pencils and a sort of slate grid object in school, but they couldn't read what they had written. And they could read Roman letter type like Philadelphia line, but they couldn't produce, just sort of like on the fly, a Philadelphia line text. A press was required. But with this type of writing, the pinpoint writing, as tedious and cumbersome as it must have been, students like Lafleur could both read and write could write and read what they had written. Here's a close-up of the letter. I believe that it was intended for a sighted reader who could also read this. If it were composed in Braille or a point system, it's not guaranteed that a sighted reader would have been able to read it if they knew the Braille system. It's likely addressed to a benefactor or recipient in that sort of type of role who helps support Lafleur's education at the MSB. From this detail, you can at least tell that a sighted onlooker likely reviewed and read Lafleur's work as penciled in edits such as this one, functioned to kind of like correct or alter Loeffler's syntax. So even though stamping was a form of reading and writing for students, it was still subjected to cited oversight, likely by an educator or administrator, and imposed that sort of burden of tedious labor on the writer. In the letter, in terms of the content, Loeffler writes of her upcoming graduation, her hope for employment in the field of music, and her desire for a piano, possibly so that she could teach music lessons as many graduates did. Her words very much follow the mission of the MSB. You can see the word improve there kind of stamped out. And so she's writing about kind of how grateful she is to have had the opportunity to, quote, improve herself and her kind of life chances at the MSB, thanks to this perhaps benefactor. So it's almost as if she knows she's writing for an audience who's very much invested in the improvement and self-support of blind students. Writing was one way that students could try to achieve some amount of self-support. One of Loeffler's classmates who was listed on that catalog of students that we looked at in a previous slide was a student named Mary Day, who was born in Baltimore, went through all these travels, and then eventually enrolled in the MSB. She gained something of a name for herself, maybe one of the MSB's sort of famous alum, for writing two narratives of her life, one entitled Incidents in the Life of a Blind Girl, published first in 1859, and a sequel called The World as I Have Found It, published in 1878. These are the frontispiece and title page from the MCHC collections, and they show blindness on display for a sighted audience, kind of like what we see in the raised type itself. And this title page shows that this is the 5th edition of Incidents, showing sort of the popularity and demand for her work. Also at the MCHC is an edition of Anna C. Smith's narrative called The Orphan Blind Girl, first published in 1865. Smith was a student at the New York Institution for the Blind who later came to teach at the MSB. And to me, this is a great argument for seeing volumes like this in person, if at all possible. There are many facsimiles of this volume and of both of Day's volumes, both digital and available from like Amazon, where they like print it out and send it to you or whatever. But those two-dimensional facsimiles can't capture what we see here as a tipped in title page in Philadelphia line type that appears in the MCHC edition for Smith's narrative. So sort of like it's a three-dimensional object, very difficult to render in 2D form. A tipped in example of another raised print system appears in Mary Day's 1878 sequel, The World as I Have Found It. Again, this is less for a blind reader and more for a sighted audience, but it shows an important shift that was happening at the MSB and at schools at large during the 1870s. Up until that point, schools had kind of done their own thing in terms of deciding what raised print system they wanted to use. So students were learning to read different raised print systems that didn't always translate, meaning you could learn one system, but if you were, faced with a different system, raised print system, then you might not be able to read that. You'd have to learn a new system. So by the 1870s, educators kind of realized, okay, we need to figure out one system that all graduates of our schools will be able to read. And you might think, oh, great, this is when, we finally got Braille, but actually, out of those 1870s conversations, administrators did begin to incorporate point more willingly, but mainly for writing, for students to write, to take notes in classes. They reproduce textbooks. It was very easy to write in point systems, both a version of Braille and what I'll talk about in an upcoming slide. But one of the main contenders in this for these standardizing a system was something called Boston line type, which we can see here, because it was called that because it was developed at the Perkins School for the Blind in Massachusetts, and educators deemed this system more legible for touch-based readers than Philadelphia line type. Because it included lower and uppercase forms and tried to differentiate between similar looking letters a little bit more clearly than what Philadelphia line type did. So this was held up as one of the most legible, accessible raised print systems during this time in the 19th century. Raised print systems were not the only major shift at the MSB in the 1870s. One of the interesting things about this preface that we looked at earlier to the MSB's 1853 charter is that it specifies 200 whites in the state who are deserving of blind education. So for the first decades of its operation, the MSB was intended only for white students, and that changed in the 1870s. And I was very excited to learn a little bit more about broader shifts in education for African American students during this time in the most recent issue of the Maryland Historical Magazine, in the article by Dean Herron, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, about African American schools in Frederick. Even though Black Marylanders were active advocates and facilitators of education throughout the 19th century, as Herron notes, it was not until 1872 that the state of Maryland began funding Black schools. So it makes sense that it was in 1872 that the MSB, thanks to state funding, opened what was then called the Department for Colored, Blind, and Deaf, or what I will refer to as the school's segregated department. And here you can sort of see the title page for the annual report for this school, which was often included in the annual report for the white department. And you'll have to forgive these images because of time constraints, but also just some just inability to kind of locate originals. After a very cursory search. So I'm relying on images that were reproduced in official school documentation, like annual reports and promotional materials that are at the MCHC. These images show the buildings of the segregated department, which originally was located some distance from the white department. The establishment of a segregated department represents a moment of access for a group of students who had been doubly barred from state-aided educational spaces, perhaps unable to attend African American common schools due to visual impairment, and excluded from blind education, at least in Maryland up until this point, and across the South. The segregated department provided a new form of access to a new group of students. This structural change still resulted in some new considerations regarding raised print. So in my sort of larger argument, I make the case that the incorporation of a segregated department was very much related to changes that occurred in decisions about which raised print system to use. One of the significant features of the segregated department is that its annual reports tend to emphasize the industrial labor that students learned and performed, often contributing to the daily operation of the school. Students performed substantial domestic and agricultural work, and received instruction in sewing, knitting, and fancy work for girls, and broom making and chair caning for boys. And this was true for students in the white department and in the segregated department, but the annual reports of the segregated department tend to emphasize the extent to which students were performing industrial labor. Though seemingly separate from their academic work, this labor was, perhaps surprisingly, directly related to it. When students, and this white or Black students, engaged in manual labor, they developed calluses and other alterations to their fingers, hands, and skin that diminished their tactile sensitivity. And this is a big topic of conversation for educators during this time period. So that would diminish their ability to perceive raised print, especially those sort of intricacies of the Roman letter systems that we see in Philadelphia and Boston line type. Again, this was true for all students, but if industrial labor was more emphasized for Black students, they would therefore likely encounter more barriers to being able to perceive raised print. So this is when educators began to consider alternatives to raised Roman letters for reading purposes. In this slide, you can see an example of a raised point type called New York point. It may remind you of Braille, but it had a different arrangement and different point-based characters so that it was not possible to learn Braille and translate that skill to this or vice versa. Educators experimented with student readers, meaning they sort of hosted these tests to see which point systems were easier for both, a child's sensitive hands, but also work-worn hands to perceive, and determined that these were easier, more legible, and also easier for students to use for writing. So with additional labor came also a system that was more accessible to touch. So a moment when administrators perhaps considered the needs of visually impaired readers over more assimilative goals for reading like the same letters as sighted students. The MSB's annual and biennial reports for the segregated department do not say as much about students' academic pursuits, but they do mention one student in particular named Albert, sometimes Alfred, Jobs from Queen Anne County, sometimes listed as Anne Arundel County. And you can see his name in the MSB's 1906 biennial report for the segregated department. You can see there's an asterisk by his name that shows that he, on the bottom, was both blind and deaf. And this was possible in the segregated department. So while the white department of the MSB during this time was reserved for white blind students, only, the segregated department sought to reach both blind and deaf students, perhaps putting these students at a disadvantage since teaching and accommodating these student groups required vastly different affordances. But this report does note that Jobs was, quote, one of our most remarkable pupils who, quote, reads and writes New York point with facility and is a fine chair caner. So this statement shows in one sentence the proximity of academic and industrial labor, both a kind of form of manual labor at these schools. Jobs would have participated in one of the most significant milestones in the MSB's history, which was the school's move, completed in 1907, from West Saratoga Street and from North Avenue to one campus that was still segregated on Taylor Avenue. And that's where the MSB stands today. The move is a time when student labor, especially in the segregated department, becomes especially pronounced. Reflecting on this move, the 1909 MSB report for the segregated department almost proudly notes students' roles in this relocation. Quote, the girls did all of the washing, mending, and housework, while the boys assisted with all the farm work and cleared about 8 acres of very rough land. Of course, it's difficult to separate exactly which labor deaf students did and blind students did based on capacity, but we can suggest that the manual labor that built the school likely had a direct impact on students' ability to read and learn on this campus. So Black, deaf, and blind, and white blind students occupied different areas of this campus. In the manual labor that built and sustained the school, Black students may have experienced the theory and practice that dominated much of turn-of-the-century thought for African American education, in particular Booker T. Washington's pedagogy of learning and self-improvement through labor. And perhaps the largely white administration of the MSB campus knowingly advanced Washington's theories of education for the segregated department. But, and this is where bibliographical evidence can be so suggestive in sort of potentially filling in some details, it is also likely that students may have read Washington's story themselves. In 1903, the American Printing House for the Blind, which was the centralized location for embossing books, predominantly at that time in New York Point, still in operation today, embossed Washington's 1901 autobiographical narrative Up from Slavery in New York Point. This was very likely the first book put into embossed form by a known African American writer. And according to a list of books held at the MSB in 1909, the MSB had a copy of this book. I don't know that it was this exact one. This is one that's at the American Printing House for the Blind now, and the image is not great. It shows it's the title page all in New York Point, and then it has sort of a decorative border around the edges. And around 1909, students in the segregated department formed the Booker T. Washington Literary Society for the Blind, which met once a week and, quote, was completely under the leadership of the students. So much so that the 1909 MSB biennial report, the only mention of this literary society, only devotes 3 sentences to its existence. But this New York Point edition of Up from Slavery in the Central Library and Newcomer Hall, which is still a main building of the campus today, coupled with this brief mention of the Literary Society, perhaps suggests sort of another layer to the ways in which labor influenced the content and the form of raised print books at the MSB. The emphasis on labor helps us transition into the final chronological phase I identified, in which raised point reading instruction and labor extended beyond MSB walls. Around the same time as the move to Taylor Avenue, administrators from the MSB worked to gain state funding for a separate institution called the Maryland Workshop for the Blind. The MSB called itself the mother of the workshop because many of its educational and training values carried over into adult educations. So other schools, other cities had workshops, adult blind outreach, but according to what I've found in my research so far, Maryland's examples of these, they all seem to kind of work together rather than as completely separate entities. Incorporated in 1908, in its first 2 years of operation, this workshop, 122 people received training. The MSB's expansion into spaces of labor also included raised print reading instruction. So they were teaching, a trade, but also raised print reading. The MSB, through the workshop, sent teachers, very often blind alum, to the homes of blind adults who could not access schooling. These teachers traveled throughout Maryland, focusing at first on the Eastern Shore, to bring reading and handicraft instruction into the homes of adult blind Marylanders. And it's in this home teaching, as it was called, that the MSB began to incorporate yet another raised print type. Blind Marylanders received instruction in both New York Point and in a raised print system called Moon type, which you can see an example on the screen. This type was actually an import from England, where in the 1840s, William Moon, who became blind late in life, developed this type specifically to educate adults with acquired blindness, and often adults who had spent a lifetime of manual labor. So they had very diminished sensitivity to learning how to read in a new way. From this photo included in the first report of the Maryland Association of Workers for the Blind, you can also see just how big these books were. This is probably, just based on what they printed in Moon type, a book of the Bible, a single book or a volume of, many volumes that made up the full Bible. And it's larger, simplified characters of Moon type made it easier to read for hands shaped by age or labor, perhaps representing a further adaptation of the print to the reader's needs. But this expanded access remained closely aligned with the goals that structured education within the school. Literacy was not an end in itself, it was part of a broader effort to produce self-supporting, economically productive individuals. As one report noted, the aim was to help blind individuals, quote, become self-supporting and, quote, avoid that terrible feeling of loneliness associated with idleness. In its emphasis on self-support, by the mid-1910s, the mission of the MSB aligned with what Rebecca LaFleur, one of the first Marylanders ever educated with state support, seemed to hope to find after her time at the MSB. So to conclude, considering the extension of blind education beyond school walls and to Marylanders who would not otherwise have had access to schooling really reveals the richness of the MCHC collections. The MCHC has an oral history of a man named Alphonso K. Butler, recorded in 1980. Became blind during his summer job at the age of 14, enrolled in the segregated department at the MSB in 1919. And in this oral history, you can hear his experience in a different way than seeing it in the archives. He talks about, the first time he enrolled, hearing a piano playing and deciding he could do that too. It's in a way kind of incredible to be able to hear this history. I mean, when you think about this presentation and the materials I'm studying, I've said the words, you can see, or as you can see, like a million times. So I'm very much relying on the very sense that the recipients of this education did not possess in a way that allowed them to perceive print. So to me, this oral history, hearing the voice of someone who lived this story is powerful, not just in the content, but in the form as well. During my research, I've been very fortunate to have contact with the MSB's Alumni Association to learn more about the 20th century life of the institution. And to conclude, I have an image that's currently on the MSB's website. Visual continues the tradition of representing raised print for sighted audiences. When Braille became standardized in 1927, which is something Alphonso Butler experienced, it represented a moment where print aligned with the needs of readers. So the Maryland School for the Blind offers a particularly rich case for studying these different systems, different students' experiences, because these dynamics appear so clearly across its archives, in student writing, institutional reports, and in the evolving forms of raised print and in the oral history. More broadly, this history exemplifies the dynamic and sort of non-linear progression still ongoing of access to blind education in the United States. So thank you so much, and I very much welcome questions, feedback, comments from those of you who are here today.
Wonderful. You can come back, Amanda. This is you and me at the end. So at this point in our lecture for today, I want to invite our audience, who have been very quiet, I've noticed in the chat. I think they're mesmerized by your lecture today. I want to invite you to use the Q&A function to ask your questions, because that's what this is for. We want to talk about this tremendous research that Amanda has been undertaking. And thank you for delivering such a layered lecture. Every fellow that we have in our library helps us understand our own collections better. And that's just the starting point of, this is what there is for future researchers to come in and take a look at. But then to learn about not only the time period, but about the communities and individuals themselves, I think is so illustrative of the experiences that people had in this system. So, and maybe as we wait for questions to come in, maybe this is a good moment, just to highlight to our audience that research like this contributes to not only publications and knowledge, public knowledge about people with disabilities and people with, people who are able-bodied and how all of us function in the world, but they help us develop new materials. And maybe you've heard, maybe you visited, but we recently opened a new gallery that is targeted for youth and family learners, where we actually highlight senses. So wherever somebody lies on the able, spectrum, we have decided to add more olfactory, more audio content than ever before, and there's a lot to play with. This is our Please Touch gallery, as opposed to some other galleries that we've had. So focusing on senses for just about every human, other than being ocular centric, like you mentioned, I feel like it makes us all richer people, right? And it enriches our human experience. So that's an invitation, to everybody to come to visit and to engage with us as well. Um, Again, please send your questions in the Q&A. I can start us off with one or two. You mentioned very early on in your presentation that the MSB was the 15th
Yeah.
school in the country or in the state. Do you know which one was the first, or where do we find the beginnings of education for the blind?
Sure. The first one to be chartered in 1828 was what is now the Perkins School for the Blind, then the New England Asylum for the Blind. And it was the result of public school educators, common school educators, such as Horace Mann, and sort of the big figures of the common school reform, who started visiting households to find students or find children to enroll, and then noticed, hey, wait, we've got another group of students that's completely excluded. The first school to actually educate, so there's of course, a conflict about who was the first, but I believe was the New York institution in 1831 in terms of actually welcome a student into its doors. So I was surprised at that too. I thought that seems like a lot of schools, but it was sort of the northeastern states and then just kind of peppered around the other states of the country.
Yes, that was so interesting.
I know.
And link to that, remembering your slides and how you spoke about it. It started with a perception of the blind, or sometimes even the deaf, as being indigent or potentially indigent. So there was that, perception you said of the disability being a calamity of sorts, and having to, rescue or save people from whatever their fate was perceived to possibly be. Can you speak a little more to that class element? Because you mentioned that the school was always a private school. Did you find out anything about who was able to attend, who wasn't able to attend? I don't know if this information is available to any extent. I'm wondering about, the backgrounds of the students that were able to attend the school.
That's a great question. And that's something, I'm still trying to answer the question of why was this school always a private state-aided school when the models on which it sort of organized itself are all sort of state-supported schools. And students, families with means could send their students to any school that they wanted. Uh, Especially, wealthier families in the South often sent their students north for education when the South lacked, a school in that state. The So I guess the quote fear around the indigent blind was not only sort of this is going to be a calamity for you as an individual, but to kind of quote from that pamphlet, also this is actually going to, according to the thinking of the time, cost the state a lot of money when you become dependent, right? Or when you're a burden. So a lot of the thinking behind a state-supported or state funding for these schools was wanting to prevent that dependence. And so, people would send, community members who didn't have family or friends and who were at risk of becoming, on the streets, beggars, that association of the blind beggar, to the school, or find some way for them to be enrolled, seeing it as a good for the individual, but also for the future of the state.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of research to be done there.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. We have another question. I believe you addressed this, but let's just say it out loud so we can confirm. Where was the MSB located before the move to Taylor Avenue?
Sure. So, from my understanding, and this is where, if I had a better geographical grasp of Baltimore, I could maybe speak a little more confidently. My understanding is that it moved from its first location on West Saratoga Street to a location on North Avenue, and then from North Avenue to Taylor Avenue. Meanwhile, the segregated department, I believe, took up the Saratoga Street location, and so they both kind of came together. On Taylor Avenue, early 20th century.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification. Um, and I believe one of our participants said it was on one of my walking tour routes. Thank you
Oh,
so much, Dr. Bilski, for that. Yes.
hi.
Um, so there's another question that we have. Was there also a history of segregation workshop for the blind? And if so, how and when did that integrate?
Sure. So my this is another ongoing question that I have, especially for the sort of early 20th century. The oral history that I refer to does not mention any like mention segregation by name. One of the things that I did learn about workshops when they were within the schools before there was a dedicated location is that students, especially Black students, would board in neighborhoods and then come to work at the workshops during the day. So they didn't live on campus. I'm not sure if that was always true of white students, but I can confirm that that was true for African American students, just kind of looking at census records and addresses. And
Mm.
employment listed for those students. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's still a question I have, to be honest. So if you find out, let me know.
Yes, and that particular participant commented and said, "Hope your extensive research and scholarship can be translated and adapted into a future exhibit at MCHC." I would love to take you up on that suggestion. So thank you, George, for that. It's certainly, like I said, it certainly enable us to have a better understanding of our collection and what we hold respective to some other repositories and what else is out there, and how this research is pieced together. And to that, maybe I can ask another question. As you went through the types of type, so to speak,
Mhm.
it was very interesting to see how they evolved from Philadelphia to Boston to New York. So, did you notice a continuity in the MSB, or were they switching from one to the other? Was
Mhm.
there a time when multiple prints would have been taught? Were students fluent in more than one at a time, or did it depend on the staff that was teaching and their
Mhm.
competency, what they brought to the table? So I'm wondering about that.
That's a great question, and it very much varied from school to school. It depended on the school's resources. There were not a lot of raised print titles until the establishment of the American Printing House in Louisville, actually Kentucky, in 1866. Um, Only about 100 titles had actually been produced, and so schools would use whatever they could get their hands on, literally. Um, but what I find interesting is that while students are learning to read whatever raised print materials they can get their hands on, they're also producing, especially at the MSB, using stylus and slate to write in point types, like the New York Point, and eventually versions of Braille. And they're creating workbooks, like entire textbooks for themselves, for future students, and that is manuscript that very much does not get cataloged in a way that it's easy to
Mm,
find. I think I've seen one at the National Federation for the Blind, also in Baltimore. But after talking with an archivist, sort of like the thinking was these are just copies of things, so they're not um, originals. Do you know what I mean? So it's sort of like they're reading all these different types, but they're potentially reading more of their own manuscripts and fellow students' manuscripts in raised point. Those are just really much harder to come by. So sometimes I think, wow, I'm actually kind of not doing justice to what was actually happening. But this is a case of when you kind of go based on what's in the archives, and that becomes the matter of
Hmm.
your story.
Exactly. There's always that historiographic element to it.
Yeah,
What has been preserved, what has been
yeah,
saved, and what
yeah.
is accessible and discoverable, which, speaks to the profession of archivists and librarians who make it accessible. So definitely, I would agree with that. There was a footnote in one of the reports that you used in the slides that I don't think you addressed it in your talk, but I saw a note about causes of blindness
Mm.
as being traced or kept record of. Do you know anything about, what was done with that type of information? Was it merely statistical? Was there an overlap with medical research at the time and a desire to understand causes of challenges with vision? Was there any accounting of the fact that vision and blindness is a spectrum at the time? You can be partially blind, you can be completely blind, you could just have, temporary disability. What was the awareness of the time from that, maybe medical standpoint?
Sure. So each school had pretty much a physician like on staff. And in some cases, students actually regained their eyesight and were dismissed. Like if you could, my opening anecdote for my book is actually from MSB records, and they say this school is open to anyone who cannot perceive the letters of a common book. And so if you couldn't read ink, that counted you as a blind person who was eligible to enroll in the school. There's accounts in other schools of students being dismissed because they could see too well, right? And so, like, they're like, okay, no, we're not spending resources on you. You can go to like the common school to use the ink textbooks. Um, but through, increasingly in the 19th century, they are tracking causes and then start really focusing on prevention. So, as much as they're distributing literature about what their school is doing, accompanying that, actually, in that first report of the workshop for the blind, accompanying that bound in the same pamphlet is an entire essay reprinted, I think, from the New York institution about how can parents prevent blindness in their children. So I think a lot of that research on the causes becomes translated into, thinking about the time period, eugenical thinking, and, sort of like, uh, what are the preventative strategies that we can take? How can we eradicate, what's perceived as like a very troublesome impairment?
Thank you. We're at time, so at this point, I want to express our gratitude for your time and your
Thank you.
research. There's more coming. So we are also grateful to the audience for joining us tonight. This talk was recorded, as we mentioned. So if you were moved tonight, please join us for the rest of our public programming season. We have a lot of virtual and in-person programs, two of which are going to be lectures again by our research fellows. We have one coming up on April 18th, and then one on April 21st. The April 18th lecture will be our Larmore Fellowship lecture, and we will delve into piracy and Kent Island and 1600s Maryland. Whereas the April 21 lecture will be more devoted to our 250th celebratory year, and it will speak about George Washington and attitudes toward monarchy in America. Again, if you enjoyed tonight's program, please also consider becoming a member or donating to the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Um, with that, I will invite back Sophie to wrap us up for tonight.
Thank you so much, Martina, and thank you, Amanda, and thank you to everyone for joining tonight. We really are grateful for your attendance and your participation. In about 2 to 3 weeks, a recording of this lecture will be made available, and a link to that is on our in our digital archives, which you can find in the chat. So thank you again, and everybody have a lovely rest of your night.